Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, listen carefully to this. For over 100 years, scientists, amateur astronomers, military radar operators, they've all tracked a dark, unidentified object orbiting the Earth. And here's the thing. After all this time, no one really knows who put it there.
Mhm.
Now, this object, it's known in the files as the Black Knight satellite. And officially, if you ask an organization like NASA, the explanation is pretty mundane, space debris, probably just a lost thermal blanket.
Right. The simplest explanation.
But when you actually synthesize the source material, you look at the decades of these bizarre radio signals, the very unusual orbit pattern, the pictures we have of it, you realize the story is, well, it's a lot more complicated than just a piece of space junk.
And that conflicting data is exactly what we're here to do today. It's our mission. We are navigating a really challenging stack of sources here. We've got everything from leaked transcripts, old NORAD logs from the Cold War,
Wow.
all the way to observations from astronauts and, complex scientific papers trying to make sense of this orbital enigma. We really have to figure out if we're looking at a misidentified piece of trash or something much more profound.
Okay, let's unpack this then. I think we have to start at the very beginning. And the beginning is, well, it's surprisingly early. This is not a post-Sputnik mystery.
Not at all.
The records show signals and even radar returns that point to an object orbiting Earth long before we launched the first human-made satellite.
That's the real crux of the historical case. When we look at the documentation of these signals, we have to go all the way back to the 1920s and 30s.
100 years ago.
Exactly. This is when scientists began documenting what they called long-delay radio echoes, LDEs for short.
Okay, tell us more about those echoes, because that feels like the first real piece of evidence that something strange is going on up there.
Absolutely. So in the 1920s, there was a Norwegian scientist, Jørgen Hals. He was experimenting with shortwave radio transmissions. And he noticed something odd. He'd sent a strong signal out, and of course you expect an echo to come back from the ionosphere. But it should come back in milliseconds. His were coming back after several seconds.
Wait, seconds, not milliseconds.
Seconds. Sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes up to 15 seconds or more.
That's a huge delay in radio terms.
It's a completely anomalous delay. No known natural phenomenon, no terrestrial reflection. Nothing could account for a delay that long.
So what was the thinking? Where was it coming from?
Well, the only way to explain it was that the signal had to be traveling an astronomical distance, way out past the moon and back, or it was being received, processed, and then retransmitted by something else in orbit.
Which led some early theorists to say these were transmissions from some non-human object?
Precisely. From the object we now call the Black Knight.
Okay, so if we follow that thread, that these signals are linked to this object, it leads us to what is probably the most extraordinary claim in all the source material, the 13,000-year timeline theory. I mean, it's a jaw-dropper. How do researchers connect a radio echo from the 1920s to something that supposedly predates all of modern civilization?
It's a huge leap, I'll admit. The 13,000-year figure comes from analyses, and we should say often highly speculative analyses, of the object's orbital decay rate and its specific inclination.
So they're tracing its orbit backward in time.
Basically, yes. If you use certain models, they suggest the object settled into its current pattern about 13 millennia ago. But what gives this wild theory even a tiny bit of, let's say, structural support is the object's unique path.
And that path is key. It's a polar orbit.
Exactly. And if you think about orbital mechanics, this is really unusual. Most of our satellites are in, geosynchronous or equatorial orbits. They stay over one part of the globe.
Right, for communications or weather.
But a polar orbit crosses over both the north and south poles, which means that over time, it passes over every single point on Earth.
So if you wanted to build a long-term passive surveillance probe, something to map or watch the entire globe, a polar orbit would be the most efficient way to do it.
It would be perfect. It maximizes global coverage. If this thing is ancient and was designed for observation, that polar path makes a very strange kind of sense. It suggests a patient, slow, comprehensive strategy.
A strategy that's been in place for millennia. Wow. Okay, so that sets the historical stage. We've got inexplicable radio signals from a century ago pointing to an object on this unique global surveillance path. Let's fast forward. From a radio room in the 1930s to the space shuttle era in the 1990s, because this is when the mystery goes from being, just sound waves to actual high-resolution photographs.
This is where it gets visual and very, very concrete. It's 1998 during the space shuttle mission STS-88.
The first mission to the International Space Station, right?
That's the one. The crew was on a spacewalk connecting two modules. And during that operation, They captured these crystal clear images of a dark, irregular object just drifting nearby. And those images, well, they spread like wildfire in aerospace circles.
And these are the famous NASA photos, the ones that
Mhm.
give the Black Knight its face, so to speak. What did they actually show?
They showed this dark, asymmetrical mass. And what's crucial, the sources all emphasize this, it was not smooth or spherical like a normal satellite. It had like these protruding arms, almost like antenna, and a really jagged profile. And it was big enough to be seen easily, several meters long.
And this is the moment, this is the critical juncture where the official narrative confronts the evidence. NASA sees this and almost immediately dismisses it as thermal debris.
They did. The official line was that it was a piece of a thermal blanket that an astronaut had accidentally dropped during the spacewalk. And, to be fair, lost debris is very common in space.
But the engineers, the dissenting voices in the source material, how strong was their counter-argument? Could it have just been a crumpled blanket?
They argued it was beyond coincidence. They pointed to a few details that just didn't add up with the blanket theory.
Like what?
First, the size and what looked like rigidity in the photos. It didn't match the specs of the blankets they actually used on that mission.
Mm-hmm.
Second, thermal blankets are usually silvery or white, for reflection. This thing was consistently described as dark, black even.
Okay.
And I think this is the most convincing part. Analysis of its motion suggested it was already traveling on its own specific orbit before the STS-88 mission even got there.
So it wasn't just dropped.
It wasn't just dropped. The crew simply encountered it.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we bring in the human factor.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the cameras. The sources show this wasn't the first time astronauts had seen things like this.
No, not at all. You can find reports from astronauts throughout the Apollo and Shuttle programs, and they describe seeing unexplained objects. Often, they describe a large, dark, asymmetric shape, very similar to what was photographed in 1998.
So we have decades of these anecdotal but consistent reports from professional observers.
Yes, multiple trained observers on different missions, all describing something that is large, dark, and highly irregular. It adds a lot of weight to the idea that this is a real, physical thing, not just a weird trick of the light in one photo.
So how are those reports handled officially?
With extreme caution and a preference for archival silence. The notes, the transcripts from these sightings, that were often quickly archived, maybe even classified, or just explained away with the most boring explanation possible.
Ice particles or orbital flares.
That kind of thing, exactly. The pattern isn't necessarily some kind of malicious cover-up, but more of a, let's say, systemic avoidance, a reluctance to publicly admit that there's something up there they can't classify.
Okay, so let's recap. We have a physical object on film. We have a century of strange radio signals tied to it, and an orbit that suggests a deep, deep history. Now, to give everyone the full picture, let's look at the scientific explanations, the skeptical ones that try to keep this grounded.
Of course. The scientific community has put forward some very plausible, non-alien explanations. The first, as we said, is just space debris.
Right.
The argument is it could be a fragment of an old broken satellite, maybe an old meteosat, and that the unique lighting in space just makes it look deceptively dark and strange.
That makes sense. I mean, space junk is a huge problem.
It is. Another explanation focuses on the signals, saying they're not transmissions from the object, but are just normal signals being scattered in a weird way by natural phenomena. Maybe some strange pocket of the ionosphere or an interaction with the Earth's magnetic field.
That would explain the long delay echoes without needing a 13,000-year-old satellite.
It would neatly. So that sounds reasonable, right?
Yeah, so why does the mystery persist?
Because of the failure to triangulate the data. What you see when you analyze all the source material together is that none of the conventional explanations can account for all three key pieces of evidence at the same time.
Okay, break that down.
Well, if it's a modern satellite fragment, that doesn't explain the radio echoes from the 1920s. If the echoes are just natural scattering, why is there a physical, dark, asymmetric object on a polar orbit that was photographed in 1998? Skeptics rarely address the object, its orbit, and the signals as one coherent phenomenon. And you have to.
So that triangulation, that's the core argument for this thing being truly anomalous. Okay, so if we set aside the debris theory for a moment, we're left with the two major theories in the source material. And this is where we get into some really speculative territory. The first is the ancient probe theory.
Right, the ancient probe theory suggests the object is a relic, a self-sustaining, passive watcher left behind by an advanced civilization.
A watcher.
Yeah, the idea is that this civilization, maybe millions of years ago, put an object in orbit to monitor our development or maybe just the planet's geology.
And that polar orbit would support the idea of comprehensive surveillance. But how could any technology survive for 13,000 years in space without maintenance?
And that's where the theory has to rely on pure speculation about superior technology, self-repairing nanotechnology, materials we can't even imagine. It might not be transmitting complex data. It might just be a silent recorder built to last.
Okay, and the second major theory. It moves away from an intelligent origin and focuses more on the object itself, unknown physics.
Yes. This camp suggests it might be an unknown natural object. Maybe a really dense black meteorite fragment or something even more exotic like a stable plasma entity, something that interacts with Earth's magnetic field so powerfully that it maintains this bizarre non-decaying polar orbit and generates the radio effects.
So it looks like technology, but it's actually some kind of natural freak of physics.
Exactly.
So whether it's an ancient monitor or some unique cosmic rock, the material confirms the mystery is still fundamentally unsolved.
Absolutely. I think the core takeaway here for you, the listener, is that the Black Knight concept forces us to consider that not everything orbiting Earth fits neatly into our little human-made categories. We assume anything up there is ours. This challenges that whole idea.
So what does this all mean? We have an object that's been tracked for over 100 years. The official story is that it's just debris. But the irregular shape, the persistent polar orbit, and those radio echoes connected to that 13,000-year timeline. It all suggests a far, far greater depth to this cosmic riddle. It demands we consider that orbital history might be much older than we think.
And consider this. If those long delay echoes from the 1920s and 30s were transmissions, and this object has been circling us for 13 millennia, what does that suggest about the timeline of potential contact? I mean, what kind of intelligence leaves a probe to passively observe for that long? Is it just operating on a timescale we can't even begin to conceptualize? That's something for you to mull over on your own.
A 13,000-year-old silent observer hanging in orbit just above our atmosphere. That concludes our deep dive into the enigmatic Black Knight satellite.